Vineland, New Jersey, August 1888. The air hung thick and humid, smelling of pine sap and sun-baked earth. On a cleared plot of land that was more gravel than soil, Gennaro Salvatorelli was building something that made no sense. He wasn't felling the tall pines for logs or setting up a sawbuck to frame a house. He was gathering stones. All day, he and his young son, Marco, worked a simple stone boat pulled by a weary mule, hauling field stones from the edges of his property. They were round, granite gray, and stubbornly heavy. His neighbors, men who had built their own stout log and clapboard homes with sweat and familiar geometry, would stop their wagons on the dirt track to watch. They saw no foundation trenches for squared-off walls, no stacks of milled lumber, no blueprint, but the one in the Italian's head. Instead, they saw a circle scratched into the dirt, 16 feet in diameter, and a slowly rising ring of stones. Ferris Devereaux, the Cumberland County land assessor, made it his business to know the value of things. He measured worth in board feet, in acres cleared, in panes of glass. On a sweltering Tuesday, he reined in his horse, a leather satchel of survey maps across his saddle. He watched Gennaro lift a heavy stone, turn it over and over in his calloused hands, and then fit it into the wall with a quiet thud. There was no mortar, just a careful placement of weight against weight. "Building a well, Salvatorelli?" Devereaux called out, his voice carrying an edge of official condescension. A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Abner Finch among them, had stopped to watch the spectacle. Gennaro wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and looked up. He was a compact man, his face weathered from a sun far older and stronger than New Jersey's. "No, senor, a house." Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A house? With no windows? Looks more like a pigsty or a smokehouse." "It's a beehive," Finch added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Man's building a stone beehive. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've ever seen. He'll freeze in that pile of rocks come January." Devereaux made a note on his ledger. He was a man of regulations and precedents. This structure had no precedent. It was round, crude, and primitive. It looked more like a tomb than a home. He shook his head, the judgment already forming. The Italian was a fool, and the county would not be rewarding foolishness with a homestead patent. What did this Pulian trullaro, this immigrant mason from a sun-drenched town of conical stone houses, understand about massive dry stone and corbel geometry that a county land assessor, a man who measured the worth of every log cabin in South Jersey, had missed? The answer lies not in wood, but in stone. Not in fighting the cold, but in absorbing its opposite. The story of Gennaro Salvatorelli's strange roundhouse is a lesson in the forgotten physics of survival. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn how a mountain of ordinary fieldstones can become a thermal battery, holding the warmth of a small fire for days on end. Before we dig into the science, help our community grow by clicking that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments, what's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Gennaro Salvatorelli was not a carpenter. He did not know the language of king posts and mortise and tenon joints. He was not a farmer, coaxing life from the acidic soil of the Pine Barrens. He was a trullaro. In his homeland of Puglia, in the town of Alberobello, he had been raised with the specific weight of limestone slabs in his hands. His tools were heavy hammers for splitting stone along its grain, trowels for lime wash, and a profound, intuitive understanding of gravity. He knew the secrets of a corbelled dome, the patient, inward-leaning spiral of stones that transformed a simple wall into a self-supporting roof. His hands knew how to build a structure that could stand for 1,000 years with no mortar, no nails, no wooden beams, only the honest compression of stone on stone. When he arrived in Vineland with his wife Lucia and their two small children, Marco and Sophia, he brought this knowledge with him. It was all he had. Their first winter, spent in a hastily erected board and batten shack provided by the settlement company, was a brutal education in a new kind of cold. This was not the dry, mild cold of the Mediterranean. This was a wet, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. That first winter became a litany of failures. The small Franklin stove they'd purchased with their last dollars was a tyrant, demanding constant feeding. It glowed cherry red, making the space 2 feet around it unbearable, while the corners of the single room remained arctic. One night, a sharp crack echoed through the shack. Their neighbor, Mr. Rossi, found his own stove had split at the flange from the thermal stress. At the Vineland courthouse, where Gennaro went to sign the preliminary Homestead papers, the ink froze in the clerk's pen nib mid-signature. The clerk had to finish the document in pencil, apologizing that the official record would look so crude. At night, Lucia and Gennaro would lie under every blanket they owned, listening to the seams of their horsehair mattress ticking pop and crackle as the fibers froze and split in the bitter air. The cold wasn't just outside. It was inside everything, a brittle, destructive presence. Lucia's gentle cough became a constant companion through those long, dark months. Gennaro knew he could not face another winter like that. He would not build with wood. Wood was a sieve. He would build with what he knew. He would build with stone. The problem wasn't the New Jersey winter. The problem was the American log cabin. On the frontier, it was a symbol of self-reliance, a structure that could be raised in a week from the very trees cleared from the land. But in the face of sustained, deep cold, it was a thermal catastrophe. Its failure was rooted in basic physics. A typical pine log wall, even a foot thick, has a low thermal mass. It cannot store significant heat. The moment the fire in the hearth dies down, the heat stored in the cabin's air dissipates through the walls and the countless gaps in the chinking. A log cabin is a bucket full of holes. You can pour heat into it all night long, but it will be empty by morning. The settlers' lives were tethered to the constant, exhausting labor of feeding the fire. Furthermore, the geometry of a square or rectangular house is its own worst enemy. The corners of a cabin are thermal bridges, points where heat has a faster path to escape. This is why frost always appeared in the corners first. It's where the cold gained its first foothold. The heat from a stove, meanwhile, is primarily convective. It heats the air, which rises to the ceiling, pushes the colder air down, and creates drafts. The result was a house of extremes, scorching near the stove, freezing by the walls with constant, chilling air currents that made everyone feel colder than the ambient temperature suggested. For the families around Gennaro, this was just the accepted reality of winter. They would stuff rags into cracks, nail extra boards over the north-facing walls, and burn through cords of wood at an astonishing rate. They wore their coats indoors from November to March. They accepted that part of the house would simply be uninhabitable, surrendering the bedrooms to the frost and sleeping huddled together in the main room. They saw this battle against the cold as a test of endurance, a moral struggle. They never imagined the house itself was the problem. They believed the only solution was a bigger fire, when the real solution was a better wall. Gennaro watched his neighbors suffer, not from a lack of fortitude, but from a lack of mass. By September, Gennaro's circular wall stood waist-high. The construction was a slow, deliberate process that baffled onlookers. He had laid a wide foundation of the largest stones, nearly 4 feet across. Now he was building 2 separate walls on this foundation, an inner ring and an outer ring, with a gap of about 2 feet between them. The outer wall was thick and rugged, built with the less shapely stones. The inner wall was a work of surprising precision, its face almost perfectly smooth. As the walls grew, he filled the gap between them with smaller stones, gravel, and sandy soil from his plot, tamping it down firmly. He was creating a single, monolithic wall 3 feet thick. It was not a wall of logs or planks. It was a wall of pure, solid mass. Ferris Devereaux returned in early October, his mood as crisp as the autumn air. The stone cone was now nearly 10 feet high, and Gennaro had begun the most critical phase, the corbelling. Each new layer of stone on the inner wall was set to overhang the one below it by a fraction of an inch. The circle was beginning to shrink, the wall curving gently inward to form a dome. Devereaux dismounted, his boots crunching on the scattered stone chips. "Salvatorelli," he said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "I've filed my preliminary assessment with the land office in Bridgeton." Gennaro placed a stone, checking its balance before turning to face the assessor. "Your patent application is going to be a problem," Devereaux continued, flipping open his notebook as if consulting a sacred text. "A homestead requires a permanent dwelling fit for human habitation. It must meet certain standards, a minimum value, structural soundness, windows for light and ventilation." He gestured dismissively at the stone structure. This has no windows. It has one low door, more like a burrow entrance. The roof is made of the same material as the walls. It is, by any reasonable definition, a primitive structure, a root cellar, a stable perhaps." Gennaro remained silent, his gaze steady. "I have officially classified it as a non-dwelling outbuilding, value not to exceed $20, Devereaux declared. "That's stable grade. It is not sufficient to secure your homestead patent. The land will revert to the county if a proper dwelling is not erected." The threat was existential. Without the patent, his 40 acres, his family's future, would be gone. All his work would be for nothing. He would be a tenant, not a landowner. Lucia had come to the doorway of their temporary shack, her face pale. She understood the gravity of the assessor's words. Gennaro looked from Devereaux's stern face to his rising stone walls, solid and undeniable. He thought of the cracking mattress ticking and the freezing ink. He knew what the stone could do. He spoke a single quiet sentence in his accented English. "It will be warm," Devereaux scoffed. "Warmth won't satisfy the Cumberland County land laws. You have until spring to erect a proper house, or you will be removed." He snapped his notebook shut, mounted his horse, and rode away, confident in his judgment. The law was the law, and a stone cone was not a house. To understand why Gennaro was so confident and Devereaux was so wrong, you have to understand the physics of thermal mass. It's a principle as old as the earth, but almost entirely forgotten by the builders of the American frontier. A material's thermal mass is its ability to store heat. Wood is a fantastic insulator, but it has very low thermal mass. It resists the transfer of heat, but it can't hold much of it. Stone is the opposite. It's a relatively poor insulator, but its density gives it an enormous capacity to store thermal energy. Gennaro's walls were 3 feet thick, built of fieldstone with a density of about 165 pounds per cubic foot. A single linear foot of his 16-foot diameter wall contained roughly 1,230 pounds of stone. This colossal mass acted as a thermal battery. The small fire Gennaro planned for the central hearth wouldn't be heating the air in the trullo. It would be charging the walls. For every hour the fire burned, it would pour thousands of BTUs, British thermal units, the standard measure of heat energy, directly into the stone. The card's numbers are revealing: 20,000 BTUs of storage per linear foot of wall. With a circumference of roughly 50 feet, the total heat storage capacity of Gennaro's walls was a staggering 1 million BTUs. A seasoned oak log contains about 25 million BTUs, meaning just a few logs worth of energy, transferred efficiently into the stone, could charge the battery for an extended period. Once charged, this massive stone battery would release its heat slowly and evenly back into the living space. This is the crucial difference. A log cabin is heated by convection, hot, moving air. Gennaro's trullo would be heated by radiation. The warm stones of the walls and the domed ceiling would radiate gentle, infrared heat in all directions. The corbel dome geometry was the second piece of the puzzle. A square room has cold corners. A circle has no corners. The radiant energy from the walls would travel unimpeded, reflecting off the curved surfaces and creating a perfectly uniform temperature throughout the small space. There would be no drafts, no cold spots, no single surface shedding heat to the outside. The entire structure would become one gentle, continuous, room temperature radiator. The heat would be held for 48 hours or more after the fire was reduced to embers, a feat unimaginable in any wooden structure. Gennaro wasn't building a barrier to keep the cold out. He was building a reservoir to keep the warmth in. That winter, the cold did not arrive gently. It descended in mid-January like a judgment. A stubborn high-pressure system parked itself over eastern Canada, pulling a wave of Arctic air down across the coast. In the pine barrens of South Jersey, this created a phenomenon known as a cold trap. The dense, frigid air settled into the low-lying valleys, unable to escape. For 14 consecutive nights, the temperature plunged to 22 degrees below zero. Then the freezing fog rolled in from the Delaware Bay. It was not snow, but something more sinister. Supercooled water droplets that froze instantly on contact with any surface. Every pine needle, every tree branch, every fence post was coated in a thick, clear sheath of ice. The world turned to glass. The glaze was beautiful, but it was deadly. Tree limbs, heavy with the weight of the ice, snapped with reports like rifle shots. Roads became impassable. For the settlers in their wooden cabins, it was a siege. The wind, which had been absent, picked up, driving the cold through the smallest cracks in their walls. The sound of hammering became common as men desperately tried to nail boards over frozen gaps. The Rossi family, Gennaro's neighbors to the east, finally abandoned their main room and moved their entire existence into their small kitchen, tacking blankets over the doorway. Their world shrank to the 100 square feet around their cook stove. They burned through a cord of wood in 10 days, a supply that should have lasted a month. Inside Gennaro Salvatorelli's trullo, there was a profound and wonderful stillness. The low arched doorway was covered by a heavy wool blanket, and the single vent at the peak of the cone was partially blocked with a stone, allowing only a wisp of smoke to escape. A small fire of oak logs burned on a circular stone hearth in the center of the floor. The fire was not roaring. It was a calm, steady blaze, its flames licking lazily at the stones. The air inside was not hot, it was simply comfortable. A thermometer Gennaro had acquired would have read a steady 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone walls, cool to the touch on the outside, were releasing a gentle, pervasive warmth into the room. There was no draft. A candle placed anywhere on the floor would have burned with a perfectly still, upright flame. This was where the theory of thermal mass became a domestic reality. Lucia sat on a low stool, mending one of Marco's shirts. Her fingers were nimble, not stiff with cold. The needle moved easily through the fabric. On a thick, woven blanket on the floor, Marco and Sophia were laughing quietly as they shelled almonds, a small winter treat. The sharp crack of the nutshells was the loudest sound in the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting nuts, and the faint, clean scent of the lime wash on the interior walls. They were not surviving. They were living. Outside, the world was a frozen hell of 22 degrees. Inside, a Pulian family shelled nuts in their shirt sleeves, warmed by a mountain of stone that had learned the memory of fire. Ferris Devereaux hated the glaze ice. It made his work impossible and dangerous. But a title dispute waited for no thaw, and he had to ride out to the edge of the Vineland colony to inspect a fence line between the Rossi property and the Salvatorelli claim. He'd wrapped his boots in burlap to give them purchase, and had his horse shod with sharp winter calks, but the going was treacherous. As he approached the properties, his horse, a normally sure-footed mare, suddenly lost her footing on a hidden patch of pure, clear ice. Her legs went out from under her, and she went down hard with a terrified squeal. Devereaux managed to throw himself clear, landing painfully on his shoulder. The horse scrambled back up, trembling. One of her front shoes twisted loose. She was lame. Cursing, Devereaux grabbed her bridle. He was a mile from the nearest friendly barn, and the horse couldn't put weight on her foot. He looked around in the fading afternoon light and saw the only sign of shelter, the strange conical stone hut belonging to the Italian. A thin plume of smoke rose from its peak, almost invisible against the gray sky. He remembered his harsh words, his official condemnation of the structure. But pride was a poor shield against a wind that cut like a razor. The only ground that wasn't a sheet of ice was the small, scuffed area around the Trullo's low door, where the family's comings and goings had broken up the glaze. He led the limping horse to the relative safety of the bare earth and tied her loosely to a frozen shrub. He approached the door, a low archway covered by a thick blanket. He expected to find a tomb. He expected a frigid, smoky darkness, a family huddled in misery around a dying fire. He braced himself for the blast of cold air that would hit him when he pulled the blanket aside. He ducked his head and stepped inside. The vindication was not a sound, but a feeling. The air that met his face was not cold. It was a wave of gentle, even warmth that seemed to have no source and no direction. It was everywhere. His skin, chapped and raw from the cold, instantly felt soothed. His eyes, accustomed to the glaring white of the ice, took a moment to adjust. He saw the impossible. The Salvatorelli family, in the dead of the coldest winter in a decade, living in what looked like a calm autumn evening. Gennaro was carving a piece of wood. Lucia was grinding corn. The children were playing a game with stones on the floor. They were all in simple shirt sleeves. Gennaro rose, his face showing no triumph, only a quiet hospitality. "Signor Devereaux, you are in trouble?" Devereaux was speechless. He could only stare at the smooth, warm-looking stone walls. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the inner surface. He expected the biting cold of stone. Instead, he felt a faint, steady warmth radiating into his palm. It was alive. Gennaro saw the look on his face. He walked to a small niche carved into the thickest part of the wall. He took down a dark glass flask, stoppered with a cork. "From my father," he said simply. "Aglianico." He poured a small amount into a tin cup. The wine was a deep, clear ruby. It was not slushy. It was not cloudy. It poured as if it were a summer day. Devereaux took the cup. The liquid was cool, but distinctly not frozen. It was cellar temperature. He thought of the bottle of grappa on his own sideboard at home, a solid brown plug of ice that you'd have to chip out with a paring knife. He looked at the liquid wine, at the family in their shirt sleeves, at the gentle fire. He looked at the massive, curving walls. He finally understood. He took a sip of the wine. "My God, Salvatorelli," he said, his voice thick with awe. The quotable line was born of this profound reevaluation of everything he thought he knew about shelter. "You didn't build a cabin. You built a hearth with a roof." Ferris Devereaux was a man of the ledger, but he was not an unjust man. The evidence before him was absolute, and it overturned every prejudice and regulation he held dear. The next day he rode his recovered horse, not to the Rossi farm, but directly to the county seat in Bridgeton. He formally withdrew his stable-grade assessment and filed a supplementary report on the Salvatorelli dwelling. In it, He described not its non-compliance with conventional standards, but its astonishing performance. He used phrases like unprecedented thermal efficiency and superior winter habitability. Gennaro Salvatorelli's Homestead patent was approved within the week, but Devereaux did more than that. He felt a convert's zeal. He knew that the story was bigger than one family's survival. He wrote a letter to the editor of L'Eco della Grande Italia, a prominent Italian-language newspaper in Philadelphia that served the immigrant communities of the region. He described, in his precise assessor's language, the conditions of the Great Freeze and the miracle he had witnessed inside the stone cone. The editor was intrigued. In February of 1889, the newspaper dispatched a journalist and an artist to Vineland. The resulting article was a sensation. It featured a detailed account of the trullo's performance, but its centerpiece was a magnificent lithograph, a cross-section of Gennaro's home. It showed the 3-foot-thick walls, the rubble-filled core, the corbelled dome, and the central hearth, with arrows indicating the flow and storage of radiant heat. For the Italian farmers of South Jersey, many of whom came from regions with stone-building traditions, the diagram was a revelation. It was a blueprint for survival. That autumn, a new kind of construction began in the Vineland colony. 5 families, the Rizzos, the Morettis, the Biancos, and 2 others, began gathering fieldstone. They did not build squares of leaky wood. They built circles of solid stone. Gennaro Salvatorelli, the quiet trullaro, became their teacher, showing them how to lay the stones, how to begin the corbel, how to balance the weight. He shared his knowledge freely, just as he had shared his wine. The frontier innovation of Apulian mason anticipated the language of modern building science by a century. What Gennaro Salvatorelli built would today be called a high-mass, passive heat retention structure. The 3-foot stone wall was a form of super insulation, not by resisting heat but by absorbing it. His design was, in effect, a thermal flywheel, a massive, slow-spinning wheel of energy that smoothed out the wild temperature swings between a roaring daytime fire and the profound cold of a winter night. He had created a living environment whose stability came from its immense inertia. Architects and engineers today use complex software to model these principles. Gennaro Salvatorelli understood them in his bones, through a tradition passed down through generations of working with the simple, honest physics of stone. In the end, what Gennaro built was more than just a clever house. It was a different way of thinking about shelter itself. The American log cabin was an act of conquest. It imposed a rigid, artificial geometry on the landscape. It fought the cold with the brute force of a constantly burning fire, a battle that was never truly won. The trullo was an act of cooperation. It gathered the most stubborn and difficult pieces of the land, the field stones that had to be cleared for planting, and assembled them into a form that understood the cold and knew how to hold warmth. It didn't fight the winter. It absorbed its energy and created a small, stable island of spring in the heart of the frost. He didn't build a house. He taught a mountain of stones to lean into each other and share a roof with the family. It was a structure born not of arrogance, but of a deep, quiet respect for the materials of the earth and the unchangeable laws of heat and mass. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. We hope you found the story of Gennaro Salvatorelli's Ingenuity as inspiring as we did. If you enjoyed learning about the physics of thermal mass, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten frontier wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other ancient building techniques do you think could solve modern problems? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.